Hi, as Mr. Conklin just said, I'm Maddie. Raise your hand if you know what a limit is. Right there, Lily. What did you say? Still can't. The end of time, yeah. Anyone else? Roxy? Something that stops you from doing something? Anyone else still? Sienna? A point where you can't do something anymore? Those are all really good answers. Personally, I think a limit can be a physical or mental barrier that is very hard or impossible to overcome. You can have a physical limitation where something is not physically possible. For example, a person with a physical disability can have real physical limitations on what they are able to do. And there are also limits on how outrageous a person can be. For example, trying to jump off the Empire State Building and fly. I know flying would be pretty cool, but that's an unrealistic limit. Unfortunately, human flight, unassisted, is a limit that we haven't yet achieved. However, there are some limits that we can push and should. As some of you know, I was a gymnast. If you have ever watched the gymnastics competitions during the Olympics, I think you would agree that gymnastics is a sport that constantly pushes people to their limits. I used to train about 20 hours a week, and I had to constantly face physical and mental limits. One of my main personal physical limitations was my flexibility. Unfortunately, I didn't have the natural flexibility like the other girls on the team. I had to work harder than them and push past what I thought was my physical limits to get my splits and become more flexible. The hardest part about it is that flexibility is not fun at all. The hardest part, I knew I had to push my limit to become a better gymnast. Gymnastics is a sport that will push your limits until you think you have none left, but then surprisingly, you go beyond your limits and find another. One of the worst types of limits is a mental limitation. Mental limits insert a block in your brain where your whole body says yes, and most of your brain agrees. But there's just that one little voice that says no. The second you let that voice take over is the second you let your block control you and prevent you from reaching your goals. Your limit becomes even harder out of reach. When the fear of what is to come makes it even harder to silence that voice, you must to overcome your fear and to achieve your goals. You must push past your limits, whether it's accomplishing a new and harder trick in the gym or doing what was said to be impossible. My dad once told me the story of the first man to run a 4-minute mile. I remember we were driving to go play tennis and somehow found its way into our conversation. He began to tell me the story of how in 1954, scientists performed a whole study of how it was impossible for a man to run a 4-minute mile. Because the study proved it could never happen, people started to think it never would, and it became a limit, known as the 4-minute barrier. Until one determined runner by the name of Roger Bannister on May 6, 1954, ran a mile in 3 minutes and 59.4 seconds, breaking the 4-minute barrier. Just a short 2 minutes later, during the Olympics, more men started running the mile in under 4 minutes. And today, a runner cannot make the Olympic team without running a mile in under 4 minutes. This is a great demonstration that even though everyone around you may think and say that something is impossible, it can be achieved. Roger Bannister chose not to listen to everyone saying it was impossible, but rather to follow his passion and try to achieve his goal. He pushed past what everyone thought was a physical limit. No woman has yet run a 4-minute mile. Is this a limit, or like the men, just perceived to be? Now I'll show you a short video of Roger running his famous 4-minute mile.
Old Roger Bannister, third from the left, gets away at the Iffley Ground, Oxford, for the race of his life. For years, he has dreamed of becoming the first man to run the mile in less than 4 minutes, and now, with Chris Brasher setting the pace in front, he's decided that this is the right moment. Bannister's old friend and rival, Chris Chataway, is in third place, waiting his time to take over as pacer. After 2.5 laps, Brasher gives way to Chataway. Bannister, a superb tactician, has suffered some criticism in the past for adopting his own rather unorthodox training methods, but they're paying dividends now. Despite the slight wind, he's clocking great time. Any moment now, and we'll see the famous Bannister burst. And here he comes. Bannister goes streaking forward with about 250 yards to the tapes. Just look at his action as his long legs carry him nearer that world record. And Bannister has done it. Though he's out on his feet, his coach and team manager tell him he's a...
Unfortunately, in life, there are some limits that are real and cannot be pushed or overcome. The trick is figuring out which is which. Just this past year, when I did gymnastics, I ran into some of the biggest limits I'd ever experienced. Not only were some of my limits mental, but they were physical as well. My first tumbling pass on floor became one of the biggest problems. It's not that the pass was hard, it was that I couldn't land it right. It was a series of 3 flips, a front handspring, front layout, front tuck. I know those last words probably meant nothing to most of you in the audience, so I'll show you a short video of the tumbling pass I just described.
Where's the music? Everything.
Now that you get the idea of what I'm talking about, I will continue my story. It started when we had a judge come to the gym before competition season started just to check our routines. My tumbling was a little off in warm-ups, but I didn't think much of it. I started my routine trying to make it the best I'd ever done. While my first tumbling pass, I knew my tuck, the last part of my routine, was a little high, so I took the split-second decision to kick out. When I landed, my right knee bent back too far, causing me to overextend my knee. I know what most likely you're thinking, ouch. And I'll tell you, it did hurt, but not as bad as I did it the next time, and the time after that, and the time after that, and the time after that. By now you're probably thinking, wow, this girl's crazy. Why didn't she stop after the first time? But I even find myself asking the same question, but I always remember why. I knew I could push the limit and get through it, but after a while, my body started to say no. I had a month in between 2 competitions. I decided to rest my knee so I could get better. After I took about 4 days off, I started to realize how much better it felt, and I was soon dying to go back. Time ticked by until I only had 1 week to get all my tricks back before the competition for that weekend. I had 16 hours in the gym to go back to where I was 3 weeks ago. I had stayed in shape doing conditioning and flexibility, the uneven bars, and basic gymnastics on the tumble track, but I still had a lot of work to do. I worked as hard as I could down to the last hour of practice each day that week, and by the end of the week, I was finally ready. The slight pain in my knee only made me want to work harder because I'd been cleared by the doctor and couldn't hurt it anymore. When I arrived at the competition, my stomach fluttered with butterflies. I hadn't been this nervous for a competition in years. Floor was my first event, of course, but to my surprise, it went well. I landed all my passes and my coaches were proud. I was so relieved I couldn't do anything but smile. It made me feel so satisfied that I had pushed past my limit and achieved my goal. It was times like those that made my decision to stop competing in the sport I loved even more difficult. When I first stopped gymnastics this summer, I looked at it as the biggest failure of my life. I kept thinking 11 years of my life and all those hours down the drain for nothing. Failure. It didn't matter how much everyone told me it wasn't. In my mind, it was. It didn't matter how much I couldn't help but cry thinking about it for a week before and after I made the decision. After another week, I could still barely talk about it, but now I look at it completely differently. I don't know who I would be without all those hours put in the gym. My teammates became my second family, and still are. I keep in touch with all the girls and even my coaches. Some of the greatest lessons about life were learned in that gym, and I'll remember them for the rest of my life. Gymnastics and my coaches taught me so many lessons, for example, discipline, determination, and limits. Through gymnastics, I was encouraged to push past every limit I could, but to also try to find barriers and limits that cannot be pushed. Because of gymnastics, I can now continue to be a great swimmer and tennis player and do whatever sport I wish, and still apply all those lessons I have learned. Now I encourage you all to find your own personal limit, whether it's acing that math test, making a new friend on the playground, or getting your essay written for the high school application. Try to overcome as much as you can in one day, but maybe not all in one day, especially that high school application. As you think of your own limits, I would like to leave you with a quote by Michael Jordan. Limits, like fear, are often an illusion. Thank you and have an awesome rest of your day.